So we have here Rebecca Pearl-Martinez, who's the Executive Director of the Institute for Global Sustainability, Nahid Bhadelia, who's the Director for the Center on Emerging Infectious Disease. Greg Wellenius is Professor of Environmental Health, but also Director of Climate Change and Health at the School of Public Health. And then Carly Ching, who is sort of filling in for Mohammed Zaman because he's doing something else very important today, and she works with Mohammed on some of his projects. And then last but not least is Yannis Paschalidis, who's the director of the Hariri Institute for Computing and Computational Science and Engineering. And so the goal of this like 25 minutes or so is really to have each of these individuals talk a little bit about, I think to begin with, what their institute or center is doing as it relates to climate change and health. And then the sort of that'll be sort of the first thing. And I think what we'll do is we'll sort of go, maybe we'll start with Carly and go this direction. And each of you, like if you could spend, 3 minutes or so, and then we'll do a second question, and then we'll open it up for the audience to participate.
I'm here representing the Center on Forced Displacement, which is led by Professor Mohammed Zaman and Professor Carrie Preston. So our center focuses on the global challenge of displacement and migration, so including refugees, internally displaced persons. And we're particularly interested in climate change because it has such a strong impact on the decision to move and is one of the leading drivers of displacement globally. So we're really interested in the intersection of the human environment and climate and displacement and how it really impacts those individuals and their well-being. Specifically or broadly, some things we're interested are the impact of climate change on health and access to healthcare in refugee populations, displaced populations, how climate change impacts specific diseases such as vector-borne diseases or antimicrobial resistance in displaced populations. And other things that we're looking at are the issue or the nexus between climate and conflict. So we have some work ongoing in Yemen where those two things overlap. And so working with local partners, we're collecting data on the ground on infrastructure, on disease burden, on infection, on climate and conflict, and then trying to build some predictive models for being able to help with resource allocation and with kind of predicting when next waves of infection may occur. Let's see, some other specific projects that the center has worked on. I think people have talked about today in their talks, the ecosystem and the different factors and drivers there are to infectious disease spread. We have been looking at the ecology of a refugee camp and how climate change will impact the built environment and the physical landscape and how that changes disease dynamics and livelihood, and trying to see how that impacts, provision of aid and trying to see how all those pieces work together and then think about that not only in the context of current refugee camps and settlements, but when you're thinking about where to build new settlements or where these migrants are going to live, because it's been known that a lot of migrants are told to settle in locations that are much more vulnerable to climate. Some other things that the center has looked at are thinking more outside of STEM disciplines and looking at the social science, so looking at climate migration narratives, and then really learning about the lived experience of displaced populations. And so how is climate change really impacting them on a day-to-day basis? And I think that's a really common thread in a lot of our research that we try to have as a component. We want to inform our research with the realities in the ground and really involve the community to have a meaningful impact.
Okay, thank you. Rebecca?
Everyone. I'm going to talk about the Institute for Global Sustainability. My name is Rebecca Pearl-Martinez. I'm the executive director. We have Benjamin Sovacool right here in the front too. And anyone else from IGS here? Okay. Anyway, IGS, similar to all these other centers and institutes across the university, works across the university and all the different schools and colleges. So we have collected about 100 faculty, very close to 100 faculty across the university. Some of you are in the room, on sustainability, climate change, and equity and justice. And we have 3 areas that we work on. One of them is planetary and environmental health, and that's an area where we do a lot of work on climate and health, and I'll give some examples of that. Second area is climate change and climate governance and sustainability transitions. And thirdly, we have a lot of work in energy systems of the future and technology markets, that sort of thing. So under climate and health, I'll let Greg talk about the CAFE NIH program in general, but I will focus a little bit on what we do at IGS under the CAFE program. It's an NIH contract to convene the climate and health scholarly community. But what we do at IGS is really focus on the non-academics side of things quite a bit. So we do a lot of work on research translation. There's a community of practice that if you're not already part of it, you should definitely consider joining it. There's like a little intake form online, I'm sure Greg will mention. And basically, we're trying to make connections across the climate sector and the health sector, but also between academics and policy folk and everyone outside academia. So it's a really great opportunity to think about your research, the kinds of ways you want to have impact outside of your journal articles or the kind of work you do, scholarly work you do. So we can help with that. So come to me and talk to me if you're interested in that kind of work. We do a number of other different research projects on climate and health. One I'll mention is we have seed funded, along with School of Public Health, a new national geospatial database that uses federal data to map out energy infrastructure and the very specific census tract level impacts on health exposures. Very, very exciting new database led by Jonathan Buonocore and Mary Willis. We're going to have a symposium that you're all welcome to join at CCDS on May 7th, I believe, so you can get in touch with me about that. And there's also actually one tomorrow at BUMC. If anyone's on a BUMC campus, come along for that. And we're really excited about where that database is going. It's very unique. We also have a project on schools, health in schools and indoor air quality and COVID, led by our Associate Director, Patricia Fabian. And so there's just a lot we're doing to try to connect across climate change and health. And I have more to say about interdisciplinary work, but that's the next question, right? Thank you.
Nahid?
Thanks so much. And just bear with me. I took notes on my phone and then I realized I'm 46 and I don't have my glasses with me. So
I'll share mine.
no, it's okay. Probably worse sight than you have. So I think you've heard a little bit about SEED already. We are the Center on Emerging Infectious Diseases. And I think in some ways where the needle focuses more on basic and translational sciences, the focus of SEED is public health and policy research, particularly on emerging and re-emerging infectious diseases. And very quickly, you've heard a bit about some of our projects, both from Kayoko. David would comment at some point about the work that he's doing. But the bigger buckets of work and where it intervenes becomes very obvious from every application and every presentation you've seen today. The inherent threat of pandemics is linked to climate change. And whether it is work with basic science, epidemiology, modeling, policy, those are so closely intertwined in how we think about pandemic preparedness and response that it's not something we can separate. So the places specifically in terms of topics where the center focuses are emergence, spread, and impact on new and re-emerging pathogens, particularly antimicrobial resistance as well, which I know Kayoko is working on. Second is impact of climate change on health emergencies. And both David and Kayoko have started working with some partners in Uganda with IDI to particularly look at the impact of climate events and on health emergencies and routine health delivery. But the opposite is true as well. I will harken back to a story a few years ago when I was responding. I was telling Benjamin and Rebecca the story. I was responding to the Ebola epidemic in West Africa a long time ago, and I was back of a truck, as one is part of an emergency. And I'm on two phones and driving through sort of this rural background in Sierra Leone. And all of a sudden I'm coughing up a lung and I stop because we're getting closer to the site, Ebola treatment unit that we were supposed to go to. So I stopped the driver and I said, I got to get inside. What is all this pollution? He's like, that's the personal protective equipment you guys are burning from the Ebola treatment unit. So just think about how many masks all of you have worn over the last 4 years. Where do you think they went, right? The impact of health emergencies on climate change is something that we think has not been looked at enough, and something that the center would like to focus on. Also, upstream levers. Kayoko talked about this impact of use of chicken as protein. That's actually part of a success story. Upstream economics have changed. You have a larger middle class in Latin America and Africa, particularly in large urban centers. They can't afford goats and cows. Chickens are smaller protein per capita per person and affordable for families, middle-class families. And so greater use of chickens is actually better marker of economic progress, but then also increases some of the pandemic risk. So understanding those economic and policy and societal impacts between pandemic preparedness and pandemic and climate change. And then very close to what both Rebecca and Les said, governance is important. If climate change is an emergency, we have to take our research from our papers and apply it to affecting change with our policymakers. And a huge part of the focus of our center is connecting with those policymakers to provide them evidence-based to change policies, to really sort of question, if policy is sort of the pathway to make impact change. Budgets are the love language of governance. And so the ability to affect budgets is the great thing that we want to focus on, and particularly the focus both for health systems preparedness as well as climate change and its impact on on pandemic preparedness. And then the last is we focus on the power of convening. Centers like all of ours have a power of convening across different disciplines and being able to do exactly what you guys are suggesting. And we've done with our semi-annual seminar, bring together private sector, academic institutions, as well as policymakers to be able to affect change. So I'll stop there. One last thing I'll say is an aspect that's common to all of our centers is an equity focus. Climate change and equity, we need to focus a bit more, particularly on those populations that are vulnerable on the front line, but also who are more vulnerable once an emergency happens. Thank you.
All right, great, thank you. So, I'm Greg Wellenius, and I'm here in two capacities. One is that I direct our Center for Climate and Health, which is based out of the School of Public Health. And that's a school-wide center, but with a cross-campus vision that we can all do more together than we can apart. I think that's, I'm sure, shared by everybody here. There was a lot of talent, expertise, and passion already here before we created in the climate and health space before we created the center. But what the center's tried to do is bring people together in novel ways that wasn't happening before. So you talked about convening. That's one of our three domains. Another one is to help accelerate, just lower the barriers to entry. There's lots of people that work in climate and health, sort of self-identify, but then there's a bunch of people that are, I would call them climate and health adjacent. They might not describe themselves as being in the climate and health community, but really much of their research is already or could be very relevant because as we've heard today, the health impacts of climate change are just very diverse and large. So we're trying to lower the barriers to entry, and we're doing that by sharing expertise, which is sometimes hard to share, by sharing data and data-related resources, which again is sometimes hard, and particularly for our junior faculty and early-stage investigators, helping them launch in this area. And sometimes that means lending them staff because they don't have the capacity to hire a full FTE on their own or as they're getting going in their funding. Or sometimes it's helping them with data that, very large data sets that are complicated and that we have lots of expertise already in processing or have already are ready. So by reducing the friction in the research system, so convening, accelerating, and really enhancing capacity in this space to keep BU at the forefront, because I think I challenge anybody to point to a place that has more depth and breadth in the climate and health space than BU, but we got to keep them there, and we're going to do that through the center activities. So that's one domain that's internal to BU largely. The other one is what Rebecca mentioned, the cafe grant or contract from NIH, which I'm one of the 3 co-PIs on. CAFE stands for Convening, Accelerate, Fostering, and Expanding the Global Community and Practice in Climate and Health. Again, we try to do many of these things that we've been doing internally in BU to do on a global scale. Obviously, what you can do globally to anybody is different than what you can do in a tight-knit community like BU, but we're trying to bring that community together, give them more resources, empower them to do more with the resources that they have, and try to build collaborations. Happy to talk about any of those further afterwards with drinks. Thank you.
All right, so I represent the Hariri Institute for Computing and Computational Science and Engineering. What we do, I'll use a term that I'm sure you have never heard, particularly recently, AI, very obscure term. So I think that there are a lot of opportunities for AI and data science and in general computational methods in the space of pandemics, infectious disease, and pretty much every one of the presentations the excellent presentations that we saw today had a significant computational component. One specific way, one example, we have at Hariri one of these NSF sites for predicting and preventing the next pandemic. And there is a very strong computational AI component in many of the tasks of this work. And this is work that involves many individuals across campus. It's a relatively large effort, including people on this panel. I'll give you some examples on where AI and in general data science models can have impact. For instance, they can be helpful in identifying anomalies. So if there is a new outbreak in some region that may have not been detected or identified as an outbreak that is related to a new emerging disease, AI methods can pick up this anomaly out of more typical examples of outbreaks. They could be helpful, for instance, in developing methods that are able to control such an outbreak before it becomes a regional or even a global concern. They can, for instance, use ways like large language models to identify emerging stories that may appear in the news or sites that may relate to an outbreak and inform the global community that in some region of the world there is an outbreak. And what AI does pretty well is developing predictive models of what may happen in the future, like the large language models can predict the next word in the text. AI models can predict what may be happening in a sequence of events. And that can be useful in terms of predicting which of the signals that we may be picking up can lead to a potentially significant outbreak that may have pandemic potential. There are many other different ways that perhaps we don't have time to cover today. One of the important functions of centers in general and institutes is the convening power that Nahid mentioned and others mentioned, but also being accelerators and essentially convergence accelerators of people that may be coming from very different disciplines and come to the center in order to identify common problems and work on these problems from very different angles. And what the Hariri Institute can do is bring a significant computational set of expertise in many of the problems that arise in many different domains.
Great, thank you. So, this is, I think, partly an effort to make people realize that there's a lot of different things happening across the BU campus. There's clearly some connections already. But what I'd like to do next is just have each person make just a brief comment or two about what you think could be done to further strengthen collaborations both within the centers and institutes and departments where there's interesting work going on within BU, but also within the greater community, because there's there are equivalent efforts at Harvard, and then I think Tufts is just starting a new center also. I'll open it to anybody who wants to go first, I guess. Rebecca?
I have a lot to say. I'll say it quickly. I think, so a lot of what we do at IGS, like other centers, is really interdisciplinary, deeply interdisciplinary. And so I just want to mention some things I think we're lucky to have at BU, and then some other ideas I have for how it could be better. One is that research on tap is amazing. I'm aware, thank you for Office of Research. I'm aware of 2 major projects that have come out of research on tap conversations, so stick around for the drinks, because in the last 2 years, it really does work. We also have, I've talked to other institutes at other universities that do similar things to us, and I found that over and over again, I hear that we have a financial administrative structure that largely allows for collaboration. I think there are some challenges, but I think we generally have that set up, and thanks to the university for thinking that through. I think in some cases there's difficulties we have to navigate with different financial structures at the medical campus and at CRC, and we have to harmonize that better. We've kind of put Band-Aids on it and we've made it work, but I think harmonization of that would help us a lot. I think the third thing that we have is very unique to BU in my experience of other universities is a culture of collaboration. I think I'm not the first person to say this, that when I arrived, people said it and I said, really? But it really is a true thing. And I don't know how it came about. Someone should do a paper on that, but it really is a very unique thing that I really appreciate. We also have a very large university with so many faculty working on climate change. A small school could not do all the things we do in an interdisciplinary way. So I think those are 4 things that we do well. I think in terms of what we need more of is more internal architecture to support communication and collaboration. Our centers are doing that. I just think we need to do more of it and more frequently. So thank you, David, for bringing us together today, for example. I also think that the interdisciplinary work that we do doesn't really fit neatly into the governance structures of the federal government that's trying to fund us. There's so many silos. And I go to the federal government the federal relations meetings, and I say, we want to do this. That's between these 3 agencies. Who do we talk to? And they're like, I don't know. So that's something we really need to help kind of inform how federal funding is designed more and more. If we can do that, it's helpful because then they know how to fund us basically and how to expand what we're doing. And then the piece of that is really important to me is, again, back to research translation. This was really informative to me because I've worked in climate policy for 2 decades, and this is the first hour of my life in which it was all about rodents and chickens and mosquitoes. So what I learned from that is how you can understand, how you can get into interdisciplinary conversations is not only just kind of coming to these things or maybe reaching out to someone across a different discipline, but experience someone else's language and someone else's policy environment. So send an engineer to a social science conference, get across those disciplines in really concrete ways. And not only inside the university, but get those people to meetings outside the university, a congressional something that's outside of your field. I think that's going to make you get excited and know how to plug in better, and we'll all be better for it.
Naheed?
Yeah. I'm going to echo the interdisciplinary aspect and the strength of BU. I mean, I think the perfect example is the NSF grant that Yannis mentioned, Seeds. I'm a co-PI with him, and a lot of the Seed faculty are on it. It's a perfect marriage of data science and computing expertise with pandemic response and communications and some of the health systems research that we're doing. So many examples like that where the disciplines from different parts of we have about 9 colleges and schools represented. We have these conversations all the time where the same problems are seen in different ways and actually add to grant proposals, papers, conceptual thinking about problems. So I'll echo that. I also echo, your whole conflict about this idea of how do you get funding where you're in between different silos, because think about infectious diseases. Every time we go to talk to them about pandemic preparedness, they say, which disease? Right? It's all disease-based, and NIH is very disease-based in how we approach it. Just one very concrete way that I think we can move ahead. And I wanted to point out something that we're doing during this event. We always talk about all these partnerships, and sometimes there's that magic that happens and you potentially get a partnership going, but we need to be more mindful and very specific about trying to get that going. And so one of the things I asked Cassandra to do from our center today is to make a list of everybody, their methodology and their subject for climate change that was presented today. We're going to send it to the Office of Research and get all your emails. So if you are working in climate change and have not yet spoken today, talk to Cassandra. We're making that list. We'll send it to you, Sarah, so you can distribute it so that you actually have emails of people and names and their methodologies of what they're working on. So I think being very concrete and mindful is going to help us move to the next stage.
Yeah, Yannis?
Yeah, so I don't think we have the panacea for this problem, but we have a mechanism, a solution. One of the questions that we posed a few years back is how do we enable more of these very large interdisciplinary grants that bring people from different disciplines together? And the thought was that collaborations between relatively few individuals, 2, 3, right, will happen no matter whether we support them or not. Where larger collaborations, they need a bit more of a runway. And we have established a mechanism that we call the Focused Research Program. So we sweeten the pot, we provide some funding, we support medium to large teams, and we would like some combination of senior faculty that could potentially lead a large award down the line, and also some perhaps more junior faculty that are involved, they are leading thrusts. And the idea is to provide them with an environment and with a space to collaborate for a year or even more, start to develop a common language, start to coalesce around a specific idea or a set of ideas, so that if an opportunity comes down the line, they are ready to respond rather than sort of scrambling and putting a team together when that opportunity arises. And not having the time to coalesce around the topic and not being competitive. So we have found that this is a mechanism that has enabled quite a bit of down the line awards that are of the larger type, they are center type. We did some calculations on what the return on investment may have been of some of the awards that we awarded in the past. We found a number of the order of 1,600%, which is a non-trivial return on investment. So please look at opportunities. One area that we are interested in investing more, and every year we have a special track along those lines for our focused research programs, is we are interested in increasing collaborations between the Charles River campus and the medical campus. We think that that's largely unexplored territory, and there are many opportunities there, and we run the special tracks that particularly facilitate these collaborations between researchers on BUMC and researchers on this side of the campus.
Well, with the disclaimer that I am one of the grantees of a Hariri focused research program, I think it's actually a great idea. It's a very unusual program. And actually even, one of the parts of the Hariri FRP that Yannis didn't mention is access to the data sciences building. And actually having a shared office space there has been, actually quite I was going to say life-changing, might be a little bit strong. Obviously, it's a beautiful building, but the fact, so I'm at the School of Public Health, which is on the medical campus, and the ability to come and meet with, have dedicated space to meet with people on this campus has actually been transformative in how we collaborate and how often we collaborate. So I think that program is great, and I encourage you all to look into that and apply as a team. I think the one other thing I'll add, I agree with a lot of what's already been said and won't repeat it, but the one thing is that there's often a disconnect between the research that we do for academic purposes, which is what we're all largely trained in, and research to inform policy today or tomorrow. And, to do that doesn't really happen by accident. You have to be pretty deliberate about engaging with stakeholders and saying, hey, what do you need to know to come up with better policy, implement better policies. That's much of what I see Rebecca doing. I've learned a lot already from her in doing that. But there's much of our work in the Center for Climate and Health is focused on urban heat and how we protect people from the heat waves that are already here. We don't need to forecast into the future. They're already here. They're already killing people. More people die of heat every year than of any other weather-related disaster, and more than last year and last year and last year. So we already know the problems here. We don't need to project to the future, but what do we do about it? And that, in some of the research I've done on that topic, I think it has more impact, although it is typically typically published in places with lower impact factor. I'm at a point in my career where that doesn't matter as much to me. So I'm looking to have the larger, societal impact. But we do have to consider that in our tenure systems, our reward systems, of course, as well, is distinguishing between high impact publications and high impact research that informs policies and how to be deliberate about that.
I'll just say, like, did you arrange to have this room be really hot for the meeting today?
Yeah. That's right. Your
Kurt
brain
Carley?
function is declining with the increasing heat.
I just have a few things to add. So some specific mechanisms that our center is doing to foster interdisciplinary work. We do have some seed grants, and human environment and climate is one of them. And we really are looking for proposals that have interdisciplinary teams. And then just another event that the center has is there's an annual conference in April. So I encourage you to check that out. In terms of how to be better, I think thinking about it from the trainee level, for graduate students, for postdocs, is how to increase participation and how to get that interdisciplinary training to that group of people. I think things like workshops maybe aren't being communicated across departments, and so a large portion of people, are not aware that these things are happening. I think today I was looking, at the different centers, and I saw that there were some workshops that would have been really interesting on how to analyze climate data, but that just didn't really make it to my mailbox in my specific department. So trying to think about how we can increase exposure in that way.
Great, thank you. So we need to wrap up, but I just want to sort of throw it open. Are there any comments or questions from the audience? Jerry?
So I know that each center has to document and demonstrate how effective it is. Is there any room for aligning the seed grants that each center has? To some broad. To align the seed grants that you individually have to some broader kind of topic that may allow you to be more efficient in your funding and actually fund even more than you do at the present.
So already some of this is happening. For instance, we have collaborated with IGS in funding some of our FRPs. I've also collaborated with SPH. This year is helping us fund this special track population health data science FRP. And when we get into these relationships, we're not looking for the credit. We're just looking for a way to create a program that multiple centers may have an interest. And by multiple centers supporting this, we increase the amount of resources that we have in terms of investing into these programs. More and more of these collaborations, I think, would be useful in building the right communities, the right groups, and making BU more well-known and visible in many different areas. As many have argued, there is a lot of action in these boundaries. And this is, I think, one of the important roles of the centers.
Great. Any other questions or comments? No, if not, then I'm going to wrap things up here. I'd like to thank the panelists for their thoughts, all the speakers for their presentations, and also the Office of Research for the support for this event. And I'll invite you all to the next room where there's some snacks and drinks. So thank you very much.